So, good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. My name is Arafat, and I teach history on the textbook platform. So, we have, in fact, from the last week onwards, we have started the NCERT series. Just a minute. So, from the last week onwards, we have started the NCERT series, the NCERT text. So we in fact started with the 8th standard history text. Got my point. So in the last couple of classes, we have discussed a few chapters of the modern Indian history. We have seen how the British rule commenced in India. We have also seen how the British went about conquering different parts of India. Even that part we have discussed. Then we have in fact started discussing the reaction to the British rule. These three parts we have completed so far. So let me repeat this one once again. Once again, a very good morning, everyone. I wish you all a very happy Diwali. I hope you all have celebrated Diwali very well. Fine. So the point is, from last in the last couple of classes, we had discussed a few topics of the modern Indian history. This is basically the 8th standard NCERT. So far, we have discussed the commencement of the British rule. That is what we have discussed in the first chapter. Then we have seen how the British went about, conquering different parts of India. That is also we have discussed. Third, we have discussed the reaction of the Indians to the British rule. So under this third topic, we have discussed how the tribes revolted. We have also seen how the sepoys revolted, etc. These two revolts we have seen so far. Got my point? Two major revolts we have discussed so far. Now come to the education policies of the British. So what impact did the British rule have on the students? Let us focus on that particular aspect. So essentially, we will be discussing the British education policies now. The British education policies. We will be focusing on the impact the British rule had on the Indians. Got my point? Got my point? So that part we will be discussing. Fine. So the point is, the British rule commenced in 1772 AD. The British occupied Bengal, and thereby the British emerged as a territorial power in India. The British basically landed in India in 1608 AD itself, but in 1772 AD, the British got transformed into a territorial entity from that of just a trading power. So I told you the British came to India in 1608. They came for trade, and they remained as a trader till 1772. But in 1772, the British occupied Bengal, and thereby they emerged as a territorial entity. So the point is, in other words, the British emerged as a political power in 1772 AD. Then what did the British do to promote education is what we will be discussing in this class. So basically, initially, the British, they by and large remained indifferent to the cause of education. By and large, the British remained indifferent. They did not do much to promote education in the country. At least in the initial stages of their rule, the British did not do much to promote education in the country. But why? Why did not the British do to promote education? It was for a couple of reasons. One, you must understand the nature of the East India Company. The British happened to be a trading company called the East India Company. So the objective of the East India Company was to make profits. And education is basically a money spending activity. So basically, East India Company did not spend much money on education because education happened to be a money spending activity, not a money generating one. And hence the British by and large remained reluctant to spend any money towards education. So I am trying to explain to you that initially, at least, the British did not do much to promote education in the country. What are the reasons? There are two reasons. One, since education is a money spending activity, the British remained by and large indifferent. And second, education automatically promotes awareness. That's the point, which the British did not want. So the British never wanted Indians to become aware of the things that were going on in different parts of the world. And since education automatically results in awareness, the British therefore remained indifferent towards education. So basically, to keep the people in dark, to keep the people in dark, the British by and large, no, initially at least, refused to spend money on promoting education in the country. Got your point. But see, the point is, in 1772, the British rule began, and till 1813, between 1772 to 1813, the British just established a couple of educational institutions. So one is a madrasa. Madrasa is a Persian term for school or college, or you may call madrasa as an educational institution. So madrasa is a Persian term for educational institution, but mostly in madrasas, religious education was taught. So basically, the British established just one madrasa at Calcutta in 1781, and the British established just one Sanskrit college at Varanasi in 1791. So in 1781, a madrasa was established by the British. In 1791, a Sanskrit college was established by the British at Varanasi. And in 1800, a civil services training college was established. The name of this college was the Fort William College. Fort William College was established at Calcutta. It is basically a civil service training institute. Civil service training institute. So the whole point which I am trying to convey is the British, in the first 50 years of their rule, had established just 3 educational institutions. That's all they did during the first 50 years of their stay. They did not spend much money on education because I just told you money happens to be a money spending activity. East India Company was more focused on making profits. It was not interested in spending money for the education of the Indians. That is what happened. So this is what we call as a phase 1. So in phase 1, the British just established 3 educational institutions, say 1772 to 1813. But in 1813, all of this changed. In the year 1813, all of this changed. So we call this as phase 2. Phase 2 is between 1813 to 1835. So during this phase, the British started spending money on the establishment of educational institutions. So basically, till 1813, the British by and large remained indifferent. But from 1813 onwards, the British started spending some money towards education. Got the point? So therefore, we call this as the second phase. And second phase lasted between 1813 to 1835. But why did the British all of a sudden start spending money towards education from 1813? Why did the British all of a sudden started spending money towards education from 1813? Let us understand the point. So the British started spending money for 2 main reasons. The British started spending money for 2 main reasons. One we call as the pull factor. Second we call it as the push factor. Pull factor is the growing needs of the East India Company. I told you East India Company began with its rule in 1772, but as time passed by, the British began conquering other parts of India. So the British first started off with its conquest of Bengal, but going forward, the British even conquered other parts of India, like say Deccan part of India was occupied. Say for example, South India was occupied. So therefore, the administrative needs of the East India Company began to increase. The point is, when British occupied other parts of India, when the British began occupying other parts of India, the British rule began to expand, and the administrative needs of the East India Company also began to increase. So to manage the administration, the British began to appoint the Britishers, the British people, to senior administrative positions. Understand this point. The British or the East India Company appointed the British individuals as senior administrators or high level officers, whereas the entry level jobs in the administration was thrown open to the Indians. Let me repeat this point once again. The point is, the British appointed the British individuals as officers, whereas the clerical level jobs in the administration was open to the Indians. So the point which I'm trying to convey is, it was the point is it was not economically feasible for the British or for the East India Company to appoint the British individuals as clerks, because that would mean the point is, the whole point which I'm trying to convey is, the British appointed the British individuals as officers, but the entry level jobs in the administration or the clerical level jobs in the administration was open to the Indians. The reason being, the British thought that by they can make use of the services of the Indians for the entry level jobs, because the British paid very less salaries to the Indians, while if they appoint the Britisher to the same clerical level job, they were required to pay a very high salary. So the whole point which I'm trying to convey is, the British reserved the higher administrative positions to the British, whereas the entry level jobs in the administration were open to the Indians. So since the Indians, the point is, so therefore the whole point is, the British wanted the natives of India to have some knowledge of English, so that they could be appointed in the administration and their services could be used by the company for cheaper prices. So the whole point which I'm trying to convey is, there are two major factors that forced the British to start spending money towards education from 1813. One is the pull factor, the second is the push factor. Pull factor is the growing administrative needs of the company. So they wanted more manpower to work as clerks in the administration. So to appoint a Britisher to a clerical level job in the administration was very costly for the East India Company, and therefore the British started appointing the native Indians as clerks, because appointing them as clerks would be cheaper when compared to appointing a British man as a clerk here in India. But the point is, the East India Company wanted Indians to have some knowledge of English. That's the point. And therefore, the British started establishing some educational institutions from 1813 onwards. So the first factor is the pull factor. Now come to the push factors. What made the British to spend money towards education from 1813 onwards? What made the British? One, there are three, in fact, there are four factors that pushed the British, that made the British to spend money towards education. One is the liberals of England. You must understand that Britain was a democracy, even in early 19th century AD, it was a democracy. And there was a group in England who began to be referred to as the liberals. So a section of politicians in England wanted the East India Company to spend money towards education in India. Basically, a section of politicians in England did not want East India Company only to make money in India. They also wanted, they in fact demanded that East India Company should also be spending some money towards the establishment of educational institutions in India. So therefore, the pressure began to come on the East India Company from the liberal sections of England. So that became one reason why the British started spending money. Second, there was also pressure coming on the East India Company from the British industrialists. So point is, by 1813 itself, Britain had become, Britain had Britain got industrialized. A large number of industries began to be established in England, and the British industrialists were of the view that through education, British culture can be spread in India, and with the spread of British culture in India, the British industrialists hoped that the demand for the British goods in India would also go up. The point is, what was the argument of the British industrialist? The British industrialist, the point is, by 1813, large number of industries had come up in England, and these industrialists of Britain began to argue that through education, the English culture can be spread in India. And these British industrialists began to argue that with the spread of the Western culture in India, the demand for the Western goods would also go up. So therefore, the British industrialists the British industrialists were of the view that the best way to sell the British goods in India was by first promoting Western culture in India. And the British industrialists argued that the best way to promote Western culture in India was by establishing Western educational institutions in the country. So the demand for the establishment of educational institutions in India also began to be raised by the British industrialists. So this became the second important group. And third is the Indian intellectuals. So the educated sections of India also began to demand the British that the company, that is the East India Company, should spend money towards education. Say for example, we have intellectuals like Raja Ram Mohan Rai, who was very active in carrying out social reforms in India in the first half of the 19th century AD. So Raja Ram Mohan Rai lived in the early 19th century AD. So he was a well-known social reformer, and he was putting a lot of pressure on the British to start spending money towards education. So this was the third push factor. The fourth push factor came from the Charter Act 1813. So the British Parliament kept passing legislations relating to India. So the British Parliament kept passing legislations relating to India. One such legislation which was passed was the Charter Act of 1813. So this in fact the British became, that is the East India Company became a territorial power in 1772 AD itself, and immediately thereafterwards the British Parliament kept passing legislations with the objective of regulating the activities of East India Company. The first such act that was passed in the year 1773, and thereafterwards for every 20-year period, the British Parliament kept passing legislations. One such legislation that was passed was the 1813 Charter Act. Let me repeat the story once again for you. The point is, it was in 1772 the East India Company transformed into a territorial entity, Soon afterwards, the British Parliament took note of the change in the nature of the East India Company, and immediately the British Parliament kept passing legislations with a view to regulate the activities of the East India Company. One such legislation that was passed was the 1773 Regulating Act. So the name itself suggests that this act was passed with the objective of regulating the activities of the East India Company. That's my point. So the British thereafterwards, that is the British Parliament thereafterwards, started passing similar such legislations for every 20-year period. So one such legislation that was passed happened to be the 1813 Charter Act, this act, the 1813 Charter Act. So the objective of these acts were passed basically with a view to regulate the activities of the East India Company. Fine. So this act was passed by none other than the British Parliament. And this act made it compulsory for the East India Company to spend at least 1 lakh of rupees annually towards education in India. This act, the Charter Act 1813, made it compulsory for the East India Company to spend at least 1 lakh of rupees in India towards education or towards the establishment of educational institutions in the country. That's the point. So the whole point is this 1813 Charter Act is a turning point in the history of education in the country, because this act made it compulsory. This under this act, the East India Company became duty bound to set aside at least 1 lakh of rupees annually towards promoting education in the country. So the 1813 Charter Act in a way forced East India Company to allocate money for promoting education in the country. That's the point which I'm trying to convey. So between 1813 to 1835, the East India Company kept allocating money annually. That is, each year East India Company allocated 1 lakh of rupees, and it kept allocating money annually between 1813 to 1835. So between 1813 to 1835, the East India Company allocated 1 lakh of rupees annually for the establishment of educational institutions. But though the money was allocated, the actual spending did not happen. The actual spending did not take place. It was because the actual spending of the money did not happen because of a controversy called the Orientalist Anglist Controversy. I hope you all are following the lecture. So the whole point which I am trying to convey is, under the 1813 Charter Act, the East India Company became duty bound to spend at least 1 lakh of rupees annually towards education, and thereafterwards between 1813 to 1835, East India Company kept allocating money annually, that is 1 lakh of rupees annually, but the actual spending of money did not happen. The money was not spent because of a controversy called the Orientalist Anglist Controversy. So let us understand what this Orientalist Anglist Controversy is. So the Orientalists are basically a group of British officers who argued that the money should be spent on promoting the Eastern type of education. Orientalists are basically a group of British officers. The chief of these British officers was William Jones. William Jones. So William Jones was a great scholar. He was a very learned man. He was very interested in knowing about the past of the Indians. So with a view to carry out research on India's past, William Jones established a society called the Asiatic Society. Asiatic Society. Let me repeat. William Jones was a scholar. he was working for the East India Company. Got my point? So, but he was very interested in knowing about the past of the Indians. So, therefore, with a view to carry out research on India's past, he along with he and his friends established a society in Calcutta called the Asiatic Society of Calcutta. That's the point. So this society was deeply impressed with, the point is this society did carry out research on India. William Jones particularly was deeply impressed with the achievements of the Indians in various spheres, be it philosophy, be it literature, be it poetry, etc., etc. So basically, William Jones was very impressed with the achievements of the Indians in the past. So therefore, William Jones began to argue that the British should spend money. William Jones and his supporters, who came to be referred to as the Orientalist, began to argue that the British should spend money on the establishment of the Eastern type of educational institutions, and they also began to argue that education should be imparted in vernaculars. So what is the demand of the Orientalist? So basically, the Orientalist basically demanded that the education should be taught in the vernacular Indian languages. That's my point. And the Orientalist also demanded that the traditional Indian subjects should be taught to the students. The traditional Indian subjects like the Vedic texts, etc., etc., should be taught to the students. That was what the demand of the Orientalist was. So basically, the Orientalist put forward two demands. One, they demanded that the education should be promoted in the vernacular languages of India, that is the regional languages of India. Second, they also demanded that the traditional subjects should be taught to the Indians. Traditional subjects in the sense, those subjects that are that have been taught to the Indians since ages, like the Vedic text, etc., etc., should be taught to the students, was the demand put forward by the Orientalist. Got my point? So the other group of British scholars came to be referred to as the Anglicists. So the other group of Indian scholars, there were other group of there were other group of British officers. Let me repeat. There were other group of British officers who came to be referred to as the Anglicists. Got my point? The chief of these Anglicists was one Mr. Macaulay. So the Anglicists, on the other hand, demanded that the British should spend money. The British should spend money on the establishment of the Western type of educational institutions. They also demanded that in those educational institutions, English should become the medium of instruction. So the Anglicists, on the other hand, demanded that the British should spend money towards the establishment of the Western educational institutions. They also demanded that English should become the medium of instructions in those educational institutions. That was the demand raised by the Anglicists. Got my point? So the point is, this controversy broke out way back in 1823 itself. The Orientalist Anglicist controversy erupted in 1823 itself. And to settle this controversy, the British governor, the Governor General, appointed a committee called the Committee on Public Instructions. They appointed a committee called the Committee on Public Instructions. This committee was appointed way back in 1823 itself. But the point is, even this committee remained divided in its opinion. The point is, even the members of this committee could not decide on which type of education to be promoted in the country. But finally, in 1835, Macaulay, that is Thomas Babington Macaulay, was made the chairman of this committee on public instructions. So basically, way back in 1835, Thomas Babington Macaulay was made as the chairman of this committee on public instructions, and this man recommended the British government to establish the modern Western educational institutions, with English as the medium of instruction. So basically, he opposed, this Thomas Babington Macaulay was the champion of, he was a supporter of the Anglicist ideas. So therefore, he rejected the demands of the Orientalists. He recommended the government to establish modern Western educational institutions in the country with English as a medium of instruction. The British Governor General at the time was one Mr. Lord William Bentinck. He accepted the report. He accepted the report submitted to him by Macaulay, and with this began the modern Western educational institutions in the country. So it was from 1835 AD onwards that the British started spending money on the establishment of educational institutions. And that's how the journey of education in India, that is the modern educational institutions in India, started. And it all began in 1835. Clear? So the point which I'm trying to convey is we had a look at we had taken a look at the beginning of education in the country, how all it began, and at what point of time it all started. We have discussed. I told you initially the British did not show any interest in promoting education in the country, but from 1813 onwards, the British started allocating money for the establishment of educational institutions. But though the allocations were made towards education, the actual money spending did not take place. The reason was a controversy called the Orientalist Anglicist Controversy. I explained who the Orientalists are. Orientalists, basically a group of British officers who were in favor of establishment of the traditional educational institutions in the country. Got my point? So these Orientalists were also in favor of promoting education in the vernaculars. But this was opposed by another group of British scholars who came to be referred to as the Anglicists. The chief of these Anglicists was Macaulay. So this Macaulay in 1835 recommended the British government to establish modern Western educational institutions in the country with English as the medium of instruction. The British accepted this report, and from 1835 AD onward, the British started spending money on the establishment of the Western educational institutions in the country. And that's how the beginning of this modern type of education began in India from 1835 AD onwards. Fine. So in this class, we have taken a look at how the British, how the educational system, the modern education system began in India. That is what we have discussed. Got my point? So that's all for today. In case you have any doubts, you may start raising questions. Any doubts, anyone? Any doubts, Sri Lakshmi? Right. So that's all for today. See you in the next class.